everybody. My name's Don Wright. I have the pleasure of having a job where I teach and conduct research in public relations here at Boston University, and I have the honor and the pleasure of introducing Dr. James E. Grunig, who's going to deliver the Dr. Melvin L. DeFleur Distinguished Lecture. Professor Grunig is a professor emeritus from the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland. He's published more than 250 articles, books, chapters, papers, and reports, many of these involving cutting-edge research. His work has given much to public relations scholarship, including a number of well-known and highly referenced theories, such as excellent theory, situational theory, and his noted 4 models of public relations. He has won virtually every award available to a public relations educator, including the Pathfinder Award for Research Excellence from the Institute for Public Relations, the Outstanding Educator Award from the Public Relations Society of America, and the Jackson Wagner Award for Outstanding Behavioral Science Research from the PRSA Foundation. His award trophy case also includes prizes that don't always go to public relations educators, including the prestigious Paul J. Deutschman Award for Research Excellence from AEJMC, and the noted Distinguished Service Award from the Arthur W. Page Society, which he received because so many senior-level public relations executives appreciate how his work has helped them do their jobs. Originally from Iowa, Professor Grunig did his undergraduate work at Iowa State University and received his PhD degree from the University of Wisconsin. Upon graduation, he taught briefly at Wisconsin before moving to the University of Maryland, where he taught for 36 years. He has served as a consultant to a number of corporations and government agencies, including AT&T, Black & Decker, Edison Electric Institute, and the U.S. Department of Energy. He also has worked with several public relations agencies, including Edelman and Reuter & Finn. Although now retired, Dr. Grunig remains extremely active within the Academy, and he is in great demand as a speaker all over the world. A huge sports fan, especially when the games involve football and basketball teams from the University of Maryland, Dr. Grunig and his wife Lori, an accomplished public relations scholar in her own right, live part of the time in Maryland and part of the year in Oregon. Would you please help me welcome Jim Grunig to Boston University?
Well, thanks very much, Don, and please allow me to put my glasses on because with advancing age I can't read PowerPoint slides. I can't see you with them on, but I can't read the slides with them off, so we'll compromise here. But I'd like to begin by probably saying something you've already heard, that you have my deepest sympathies and concern for what you all had to go through the last week or two. And I know it's been a traumatic period for you, and I think it was very fortunate that this talk wasn't scheduled for last week, because I probably wouldn't have gotten here, and we wouldn't have been able to have this big event. And I've talked a little bit with some of the people I've talked today about similar events in my background. A few years ago we had a sniper in the Washington, D.C. area that, forget how many people he killed, but the first shooting was about 15 minutes from my house at a place where I now go to see web medical specialists occasionally. And Otto Lurbinger and I were on Long Island the day before 9/11. And I don't know if you got home, Otto, but I
got home barely.
We were working together on a project, an evaluation team for the public relations efforts at Brookhaven National Laboratory. And I went home on, I think it was a Monday evening, and was home, but some of my colleagues on the team stayed there, and I don't think some of them got home for a week, something after 9/11. So it's very unfortunate that people somehow believe that violence is a way to solve problems, but I guess that as long as there are such people, we all have such stress to deal with. But to move to my topic, it's a great pleasure and honor to have been invited to do the DeFleur Lecture. I read Melvin DeFleur's books when I was in graduate school. I learned mass communication theory from his book, Theories of Mass Communication. Indeed, I used it for many years when I taught a course in mass communication theory as well as in public relations. To be asked to Boston University, I think also is a great honor. The Boston University, I believe, had the first department in the United States that was named Public Relations. I'm not sure if you all know this, but this college was first known as the School of Public Relations at Boston University before all of the other areas moved in on it, so to speak. And now, it's typical in public relations, we're often kind of a stepson or something of other disciplines, but I think Boston University has a very distinguished history in public relations, education and research, and you would be surprised if you go around major corporations and public relations firms, how many people came from Boston University. And I have many of my own students who have master's degrees here and are great fans of Otto Lurbinger and others who went on to do PhDs at the University of Maryland. But that's the Boston University School of Public Relations, I think, was founded in 1947. And about that same time, the University of Maryland developed a Department of Journalism and Public Relations. And I had a dean of journalism later on who refused to acknowledge that. He said, this is journalism, not public relations. And I said, well, it was founded as a School of Journalism and Public Relations. And it, along with Boston University, was one of the first such schools. But I think that when I started teaching public relations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I started teaching public relations at the University of Maryland without really having ever studied public relations, because there really wasn't much, at least at the graduate or PhD level in those days, in public relations. And my dean asked me first, when I started teaching, I was hired mostly to teach communication theory in a new master's degree program and then eventually a PhD program. But they said, well, we don't have the master's degree yet, so what can you teach in the meantime? And I said, well, first I said editing. And I've been an editor of publications, and I said I could teach editing. And he said, no, we have a faculty member who's taught that for 30 years and he doesn't want to share. But I said, well, I could teach public relations. So I soon learned that I really didn't know much about public relations to teach. And so I started being trained as a theorist. I began looking for research and theories and so on that I could use. The first thing I came across was books written by Boston University public relations faculty. So on Monday, I started looking through my bookshelf in the very dusty parts of it to see what I could find. And because I knew these books were there. The first one I found was Otto Lurbinger and Albert Sullivan, Information, Influence, and Communication, which was a reader that was published in 1965. And in that book, there is indeed a chapter that I remember very well, written by Albert Sullivan. Probably most of you don't know him. I guess I never really met him, but it was on ethics and values, which I think that's probably one of the seminal pieces ever written. But the next thing I came across was a book called Design for Persuasive Communication, which your own Otto Lurbinger wrote in 1972, I'm sorry. But Otto has been a good friend for many years. As you may know, he was a BU faculty member for 50 years. He's been a good friend for most of those 50 years. I'm not sure when we first met, but we also had many good times on the Brookhaven Laboratory evaluation team. We had lots of good meals together and times together. So it's been a pleasure to know Otto all of these years. We also collaborated, Otto co-edited PR Reporter with Patrick Jackson, who was a very eminent practitioner located in Exeter, New Hampshire, who was very closely aligned with the Boston University School. But the next book I came across was one called Communication and Public Relations. It was written by Edward J. Robinson, who was a social psychologist who applied theories of attitudes, change, and persuasion to public relations. He published that book in 1966. And a second book that I used in the research course was called Public Relations and Survey Research that Edward Robinson published in 1969. If you have trouble finding those books, you can call me. They're still on my shelf. And I haven't thrown them out yet. I'm in the process of cleaning out my basement and my office, so things are going out. I also knew a faculty member here, Carol Hills, that I met through PRSA, and I think Carol and I were lecturers in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I think this is the first time we met each other. We were both lecturing in the Canadian Public Relations Society meeting, so I knew her for many years. But on a more contemporary basis, Boston University is one of the few universities with a named endowed chair in public relations, the Burson Chair. And we're quite fortunate to have Don Wright as holding the Burson Chair. He's one of the most esteemed public relations educators in the world, and also has been a friend for many years. And Don may not remember this, but you're the one who encouraged me to join PRSA when I thought I was a communication theorist and too good for PRSA. And I gave a lecture at PRSA, and then I got more and more into public relations theory. So that's my introduction. So let me move on to my topic, from symbolism to strategy, personal intellectual history of public relations theory. And what I'm going to do here is, as I said, when I started teaching public relations, aside from the books that I've mentioned, mostly by Boston University faculty members, and some of the textbooks such as Cutlip and Sender's Effective Public Relations, I also studied under Scott Cutlip, and I knew him quite well. And Don, he was Don's dean for quite some time, and the two of us helped work to get the Deutschman Award for Scott Cutlip, and I consider that one of the press agency triumphs of my life, because we were successful in bringing that about. But Scott, at the time I did a paper on Scott Cutlip, and I looked through his first two editions, I think published in 1950 and 1952, and I could find basically a rudimentary outline of the same public relations theories we use now, but more in a descriptive sense. Scott was never a researcher or a theorist. But essentially, there was no public relations theory, and as I started teaching public relations, I realized that I was going to have to take the communication theories that I'd been taught in graduate school and begin to apply them to public relations, and then to go beyond it, because public relations needs a set of theories of its own, because it's a unique communication discipline from others. But I'd like to talk a little bit about intellectual history, because I'm calling this a personal intellectual history. How did I develop the ideas that I have? When I wrote a textbook, Managing Public Relations, it was published in 1984. I wrote a chapter on the history of public relations, which was very much like the history chapter in every other public relations textbook. In a sense, it was rephrasing of Cutlip and Sender's chapter on history, which was mostly a history of prominent people in public relations. And I taught an introductory public relations course for many years, and the thing that most bored students was the sections on public relations history. We talked about Ivy Lee, and we talked about P.T. Barnum, and we talked about Ed Bernays, and so on, and students could really care less about it. And so I was trying to make something out of this, and I said, well, and this is where I came up with the ideas of models of public relations. What P.T. Barnum was doing, and you could call press agentry. What Ivy Lee was doing, you could call public information. What Bernays was doing, you could call two-way asymmetrical. And I'm not sure who invented the concept of two-way symmetrical communication, except that I'll take credit for it. But I worked on a second edition of Managing Public Relations. At the same time, I was working on the excellence study. And I found that in contrast to all of the AT&T commercials about asking small children if it's better to do one thing at a time or two things at a time, that's all wrong. You can't really do two things at a time and do either one very well. So I found that I had to finish the excellence project, and I never really finished the revision of Managing Public Relations. And now I just don't have the motivation to do it any longer. But one thing I did do was rewrite the history chapter. And I came across an article by a faculty member, I think at Boston College, who wrote about intellectual history. And this was very interesting too. Intellectual history looks for the sources, the origins of ideas. Where did ideas come from and how did they develop? And so then I used models of public relations as a way of looking at, where did these ideas come from? Why do we think public relations is about images, or public relations is about persuasion, or about something else? So I then reshaped that history in terms of the different ideas, what I call the symmetrical idea and so on, and where did that originate. And my wife claims that if we studied the history of women in public relations much earlier, we would have known that symmetrical public relations was practiced by a woman who was an aide to Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. And that predated P.T. Barnum, and so all public relations didn't really start with P.T. Barnum, as we often think. But as I say, I've spent most of my life, I gave a talk last summer in Slovenia that was called My Life in Public Relations. And I said, well, I really haven't spent my life in public relations as much as I spent my life thinking about public relations. So the history part of it was very important to me. But I'd also like to quote Soren Kierkegaard, the theologist, who said, basically, life is lived forward but understood backward. So it's nice to look back on one's career and it all seems to make sense, but keep in mind that I had no idea what I was doing as I went along until when you look back and then it seems to make sense to you. But the other point, most ideas come from solving problems. And this whole idea has been the basis of much of what I've done in my career. Karl Popper, who's a philosopher of science, basically said all research, all scientific inquiry comes about as a way of problem solving. And also John Dewey was a pragmatic American philosopher in the 1920s, wrote several books that became the basis for my work. One was called How We Think, and essentially Dewey said, one doesn't think until we encounter a problem, something that's missing in a situation, or something that is different from what we expected. And he wrote another book that was called Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, which is essentially saying we don't communicate or seek information unless we experience problems. And then he wrote a third book that was called The Public and Its Problems. And this whole idea is that publics come about when they experience the consequences of the behavior of someone else who makes a decision without taking him into account. So this was the whole idea that life is about problem solving. So let me get into this point what I think are competing paradigms in public relations, and these competing paradigms will help us to understand somewhat why I thought that we needed a different public relations theory than from the prominent communication and mass communication theories that are evolved. Even today, if you read PR blogs and discussion sites and so on about public relations, you see there's a divide, I think, between two competing functions in public relations. So there's this ongoing debate about what public relations is. So on the one hand, there are those that think that public relations is all about messaging, publicity, information, media relations, etc. That public relations is essentially a journalistic residence or a journalistic method. And the question is, why do we do this? Theoretically, question is, what good does all of this do? Why do organizations need publications? Why do they need news releases? Why do they need campaigns? What value does it have to an organization? And essentially, if you would ask a journalism dean or professor why they need this, it would probably come up with the notion that all this favorable information creates a good image. And then we'd have to ask the question, well, what in the world is an image? And I found 16 competing definitions of that concept in the literature, so I've essentially concluded that it has no meaning. If something means everything, it means nothing, so I move on. But if you move into advertising and marketing people, basically they would say public relations is a marketing function. It's a way to support the marketing function through media publicity. Now, if you move on to someone like myself, I'd say public relations is a strategic management function. Public relations is more than messaging, it's more than campaigns, it's more than news releases. That public relations should be an active participant in strategic management or the important making important decisions in an organization. So public relations should be an active participant in decision making along with marketing, human resources, government relations, finance, legal, all of the other organizational functions. That public relations must provide something unique in the management function. And it does that by providing publics a voice in decisions that affect them, and it helps build relationships for other functions, including marketing, but public relations and marketing are different functions. So I call these two competing paradigms that are reflected in that debate about public relations. One, the symbolic interpretive paradigm, which essentially is what I think has been institutionalized in the minds of many practitioners, but particularly in the minds of journalists, particularly in the minds of marketing people, and I think in the minds of most of the general population when they're asked what public relations is all about. So in this paradigm, the idea that the emphasis on public relations is to somehow generate messages that get the public or try to influence the public to think about or to interpret the behavior in an organization in a way that makes the organization look good. And the concept to buffer the organization from its environment. Top managers in organizations would love to have somebody come in who are good at messaging and make the public think that what is probably an irresponsible decision is somehow good for them, or to somehow get them to buy into that they weren't involved or something else. So the whole idea is to change the way people interpret the behavior of the organization, but not to change the behavior of the organization itself. And I think, what do we mean by interpretive? Well, they're all some sort of cognitive representation, some way in which people think about the organization. And these have been given different names: image, identity, impressions, reputation, brand, and so on. All have one thing in common, that they are cognitive representations, in other words, thoughts that people have in their mind. So again, the emphasis is on publicity, media relations, this sort of thing. And essentially this paradigm thinks of public relations in terms of messages and campaigns, rather than programs to cultivate organization public relationships. Now, what I have tried to develop over the years, and I think it's still not been institutionalized, although I think that if you look at most major corporations in the United States, you'll find that this is the way they practice public relations. But what I call the behavior or strategic management paradigm looks at not so much the meaning or the cognitions that people have of organizations, although that's still part of public relations, but they look at the behavior of the organization as the primary focus of what public relations does. That public relations participates in strategic decision making, and public relations is a, quote, bridging rather than a buffering activity. I take these words from a Dutch communication theorist, Kees van Riel, who took it in turn from a sociologist, William Scott. so that the purpose of public relations is to build bridges between organizations and publics rather than to use impressions to try to buffer the organizations from its publics, so the organizations can do whatever it wants. So in this paradigm, we get away from essentially one-way or asymmetrical communication and to emphasize two-way communication and symmetrical communication of many kinds. You can still use media, you can still use social media, you can still use brochures or whatever else, but you're doing it in a way to help people solve problems and to provide them with quality information about organizational decisions that affect them, to facilitate a dialogue rather than a way of trying to make the organization look good. So now, if I start back to stage one of my intellectual journey, I did not know that I was working on a strategic management paradigm. I really didn't know that until maybe 10 years ago or so. And I didn't know that until a colleague from the United Kingdom, John White, told me, what you're really doing is strategic management. But I bumbled along solving one problem at a time. So the first stage of my journey was research on the behavior of publics and the development of the situational theory of publics that began in the 1960s. Now, I was in graduate school in the 1960s. I did a master's degree. I did actually an undergraduate degree in agricultural journalism at Iowa State University. And I went to the University of Wisconsin and did a master's degree in agricultural economics because I essentially wanted to write about research on agriculture. I worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I worked for the Agricultural Extension Service at Iowa State University, and so on. I had taken a job in 1965 in the Public Relations Department of the Wilson Meatpacking Company. And Lyndon Johnson created a life problem for me that I had to deal with. In other words, the Vietnam War. And I discovered that 10 days before I was getting married that they would start drafting married men at midnight that night, and that I would probably be going to Vietnam. So I decided that this would be a good time to get a PhD. So I got Lyndon Johnson to thank, or to blame if you want to know the origin of the theories I'm talking about. So I moved from agricultural economics when I wanted to write about economics and went into the master PhD program at the University of Wisconsin. But at the time, communication theory was basically dominated. We've taken much of what we do from social psychology, sociology, and other fields. So communication theory was dominated by theories of persuasion, attitude change, dissonance, cognitive dissonance theory. I assume you've heard about that. Theories of information seeking, which essentially said people seek information to reinforce their attitudes. So, and also immediate effects, what effect does the media have on people? And we went through a period where the limited effects period, and you read about it in Mel DeFleur's book, that really discovered that the media have limited effects. And then when we began to look beyond changing of attitudes, we discovered agenda setting, which I think Max McCombs talked about a year ago, which is essentially saying the media have cognitive rather than attitudinal effects. But for the most part in the 1960s, communication theorists tried to explain what communication does to people. How can you affect people through communication, and not how and why people communicate. And one of my primary mentors at the University of Wisconsin was a man named Richard Carter, who spent, I think, three or 4 years at Wisconsin and then went to the University of Washington for the rest of his career. Most people have never read anything that he wrote because he was a very brilliant man, but he couldn't explain it very well, and so it was very difficult for him to publish things. But those of us in his classes were very strongly influenced by him. Well, he had emphasized the idea of communication behavior. Let's try to explain how, when, and why people communicate. Because if we understand why people communicate, then we are able to communicate with them. with a very simple premise. If you want to communicate with someone, it's much easier to communicate with someone who is communicating with you. So I often tell this to my classes, you know, if you're not in class, I can't communicate with you. If you're in the back row sound asleep, I can't communicate. If the person in the front row who's hanging on every word is an active participant and able to communicate with you. So if we just thought of information campaigns and so on in the sense of who is actually interested and has the need to communicate with us, we'll be much more effective and we'll understand communication much better. Well, this is also, I read John Dewey's The Public and Its Problems. I spent 2 years in Colombia doing research on actually the information-seeking behaviors of Colombian large landowners, latifundistas, and then a second year doing research on Colombian peasants. And I spent many days and hours tramping up and down the mountainsides in Colombia talking to peasants. And I began to understand that the reason they're not modern and progressive and innovative and so on is not because they're ignorant, but because the institutions that are supposed to provide them information don't understand their life situations and don't provide them with relevant information. So my dissertation then produced a situational theory of publics, which again you may or may not have been involved with or may not have read it. Still a very good, I think a very good chapter on this theory that's included in my textbook, Managing Public Relations. I don't have time to go completely into this theory, but I just mentioned that the dependent variables, the thing I was trying to explain, was 3 different types of communication behaviors of publics. Information seeking, which is when people actively go out in search for information. Information attending is when information comes to them even though they don't look for it, such as most television commercials or reading a magazine in the dentist's office or something of this sort. And then more recently, information giving, when do people talk to other people and pass on information, which is extremely relevant to public relations because you want people, you know, to say good things about you to other people and not to say bad things. What we've learned is that they're much more likely to say bad things than they are good things, and for very good reasons. Well, what explains these communication behaviors in essentially 3 variables: problem recognition, constraint, which is, I've mentioned, people communicate when they recognize a problem or something missing in their situation. Constraint recognition, people are more likely to communicate when they think there's something they can do about that problem, which was a concept I learned and developed in Colombia because I found most of those peasants were so constrained in their situation that the information being given to them about new agricultural practices couldn't be used anyway. They either didn't have the money to pay for it or they couldn't market their products or something of that sort. And then the concept of level of involvement, which I took from a theorist called Krugman, that people are more likely to communicate when they perceive that there's some sort of connection between themselves and the problem that they're being dealt with. So in my textbook, I then use this theory to define and identify 4 types of publics. Non-publics, which are people who have no reason at all to communicate with you or your organization. Latent publics, who probably are experiencing a problem but haven't recognized it yet. Passive publics are those that might think about a problem but don't feel that it involves them in any way, so they don't actively communicate. And then active publics that are out actively seeking information, and activist groups, which are those that are active, such as Greenpeace or other activist groups that have created a great deal of problems for organizations. Public relations people spend most of their time trying to communicate with non-publics and latent publics, and not enough time dealing with active and activist publics. The whole idea is that if you can identify the active publics, you're first communicating with the people, the publics the organization actually needs a relationship with, and those that are more likely to be communicating with you. And the second stage then of my intellectual journey was research in the 1970s on how characteristics of organizations and management affect the behavior of public relations practitioners. and the departments, and this I call it were the models of public relations. I came back from Columbia convinced that the reason communicative development doesn't occur in third world countries, it's not so much because of the ignorance of the publics, but because of the way organizations that were supposed to be helping them to try to communicate with them. So I then delved into organizational theory, organizational sociology in particular, but also organizational communication, to look at characteristics that would explain how and why organizations practice public relations. So public relations became the dependent variable, what I was interested in explaining. I started with a simple concept. I had to have what my dependent variables, what are the types of communication that organizations do. And the first thing was a simple one-way and two-way, something I learned from Scott Cutler in his class. And then I went on and I read a book by Lee Thayer called Communication and Communication Systems that described what he called synchronic and diachronic communication. And synchronic is essentially persuasive communication, where you're trying to synchronize the behavior of someone else with you. That is, you want them to be synchronized, so you try to persuade them so that they behave in ways that is good for you. And then he called diachronic communication, in which you're trying to work together to jointly co-orient or to be involved with each other. One of my students in a seminar was a philosophy major, had been a philosophy major, and he said, "You don't know what the terms synchronic and diachronic mean." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, literally, they mean at one time and at two times. And that's not really what you're talking about." So we thought and tried to come up with another term. So we came up with symmetrical and asymmetrical. Being asymmetrical, where the emphasis is on changing the behavior of the other party, of the public, whereas symmetrical means changing the behavior of both, engaging in dialogue or interacting with each other. So as I said, I used these. That was eventually led to the birth of the four models of public relations: press agency, public information, two-way symmetrical, and two-way asymmetrical. As I said, I used this to explain the history in managing public relations. But then those models became the focus of an extensive period of research that were done primarily by my master's students, who looked at how all different kinds of organizations, which models they practiced, and why did they do it. Could we explain it by the structure of the organization, the environment of the organization, and so on. And we essentially came to the conclusion that most of those variables in organizational theory didn't explain a lot, but really explained why public relations people did what they did was because of what they knew. Very simple theory. People know what they know how to do. So if you hire a journalist to do public relations, they do journalism. If you hire an advertising person, he or she does advertising, and so on and so on. But eventually we incorporated this into the study excellence in public relations and communication management. But many people equate the excellence theory only with the symmetrical model, but actually that model was only part of it. Well, during this period, then, I also spent about 5 years in the 1970s doing evaluation, or helping AT&T construct a way of evaluating the effectiveness of its public relations programs. And actually, I did much of that research here in Boston with what was then the New England Telephone Company. But the management at AT&T had constantly had the problem of going to state regulatory commissions and explaining why a monopoly needed to have a public relations department. Because they said, "You're a monopoly, why do you need to convince people to use you?" So Ed Block, who was the vice president of public relations at AT&T and a very prominent public relations practitioner, put together a unit to try to come up with a system of evaluation. I worked with a man, Jim Tyrone, who had come out of the Bell Laboratories, and working with him, we decided that the way to evaluate public relations was not look at the entire public relations function, but to look at individual programs like media relations, community relations, employee relations, educational relations, and advertising, and come up with a set of objectives and measures of those objectives so we could evaluate them. And I say co-orientation theory, which was a theory I learned at the University of Wisconsin. It was pioneered by Stephen Chapey and Jack McLeod. It essentially moved from receiving a message to remembering a message, to evaluate, to accepting it as your own thought, attitudes, and behavior. And we looked at it both ways. We looked at how information coming from outside the organization affected management, as well as how information going out affected the publics. So that essentially framed public relations into, we were looking at evaluation strictly of particular programs in public relations, not the entire function. Well, in 1984, the International Association of Business Communicators put out a request for proposals that asked the question, we would like somebody to do research that answer the question, how, why, and to what extent does public relations affect the achievement of organizational objectives? And this became very interesting because we were moving from the level of individual public relations programs to the entire function. What value does public relations have to an organization? So we spent about almost 20 years working on that research. There was a team of 5 of us. We wrote 3 books. We incorporated a number of general, specific level, medium range theories into an overall general theory. So we looked at roles of public relations people play, the manager versus technician roles, the models of public relations, strategic management literature on how public relations would fit into strategic management. We looked at organizational theories of effectiveness, when is an organization effective, and how public relations might contribute that. We read every book on excellence in management, such as In Search of Excellence, and so on. We looked at how the function was organized. Should it be part of marketing, or should it be separate from marketing? We looked at power, when do public relations people develop power. We looked at the nature of publics. We looked at the role of activist groups. We looked at internal communication. We looked at organizational culture, and how organizations evaluate. We looked at ethics, and eventually looked at globalization. So you can see this was a huge undertaking, and just the literature review was a book of about 650 pages. But we surveyed 310 organizations. We did questionnaires of the heads of communication, the CEOs, about 3,400 employees, about 20 in each organization, in 3 countries. Actually, there was about 1,700 questions on those 3 questionnaires. We put that into a statistical function through factor analysis that we could place organizations into what we call the excellence factor, and place each organization on a continuum from most excellent to least excellent. We took 24 of the most and least excellent organizations and interviewed them in depth, and eventually we published the final book in 2002. The premises of the excellence theory, essentially, I call it a general theory, but it begins with the major premise. The value of public relations comes because public relations creates value for organizations and for society by cultivating relationships with strategic stakeholders or publics. And these relationships are an intangible asset. We're often asked, what is the financial value of public relations? Well, financial experts talk about tangible and intangible assets, and I think we're able to show that relationships are a valuable intangible asset that makes some organizations worth more on the stock market. Good relationships bring in more revenue. They reduce costs that come about because public protest and media write negative things. And then essentially it reduces the risk when management makes decisions because of the negative, reducing the possible negative impact that it might have on the publics. Well, we came up with, I'm summarizing a very complex theory, but excellent public, we asked then the question of how should you organize a public relations department, theoretically, to be able to create better relationships more often. And we essentially said, well, public relations is excellent when it's a managerial rather than just a technical function. When it's a strategic function, it's involved in strategic management. When it follows a symmetrical model of public relations. When it's diverse, when it has women and minorities in its public relations department, as well as white males. When it's integrated but not sublimated to functions like human resources or marketing. We need to integrate all communication for all of your publics, but if you place it under marketing, you tend to only communicate with consumers. If you place it under human resources, you only communicate with employees and so on. Then also, it's socially responsible, ethical, and finally global. Well, then I put stage 5A and 5B of my intellectual journey because this is essentially the post-excellence theory stage and some of the things that we've done since that time. But two things really came out of the excellence study that are important. One was that public relations needs to be a strategic management function, and second, that we ought to emphasize relationships when explaining the value of evaluating public relations. So in stage 5A, developing tools for public relations is a strategic management function. That in my graduate seminar on public relations theory, we went through many of these tools that we look for in the literature of strategic management. And I won't get into all of these, but concepts, how do we globalize the theory? Should public relations be different in countries outside the United States? And we came up with what we call a theory of generic principles and specific applications. That at a very generic level, public relations is the same in every culture and every political system, but these generic principles have to be applied differently in different cultural and economic and political situations. Environmental scanning, how do you identify publics and how do you scan the environment to bring information into management? Who are the publics, what are the problems they're facing, and what are the issues that they bring about for the organization, which in turn leads to understanding such things as issues management and rumor control and so on. The situational theory of publics through the work of Jong-Nam Kim, who was my last PhD student, is evolved into a situational theory of problem solving, which I think extends to situational theory. And scenario building, which was done by Min Jung Sung, who is the BU graduate actually, the idea that if we're going to convince management that certain decisions are going to bring about public problems for publics who are going to create issues, to convince management to make a different decision, we need to construct scenarios of what is likely to happen if a certain decision is made. And so we began to look at the literature on scenario building for use in public relations. Empowerment of the public relations function, which is, most public relations people are not respected and used in a strategic way by top management. So what are the characteristics of organizations that empower the public relations function? And essentially we found that knowledge is key, or that practitioners who understand the organization that they work for, which many actually don't, and who understand public relations as a strategic management function, tend to have more power and more influence in the organization. And then developing theories of ethics and providing an ethics theory to go along with this, and primarily has been done by Shannon Bowen, who is now at the University of South Carolina and has done an excellent job there. But then moving forward in measuring value, how do we measure relationships, and what are the relationship with relationships to reputation? So stage 5B of my intellectual journey was conceptualizing and measuring relationships. Because if indeed the value of public relations comes through relationships, then how do we know we have a good relationship with our publics? So here we looked at theories of interpersonal communication, particularly work by Daniel Canary, and to work primarily by Christine Yiwei Wang, who taught in Taiwan and now at Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Flora Hung, who is another BU graduate. We took these concepts, and I won't go through each of them, but these 4 areas of relationships, and we developed an instrument that was published by the Institute for Public Relations, in which one can measure the quality of the relationship that organizations have with each of their publics. And Don mentioned work that I did with Edelman Public Relations. Edelman actually took this and has been using it extensively in its evaluation. Just a bit more about relationships to come to a conclusion here, that somebody, if you ask me about the models of public relations, and they've been discussed more than anything else in the world, and people keep talking about them, essentially at the point when I moved on, that I realized they are 4 boxes and that they're useful for describing different ways that organizations do public relations. But what we've done is move those models into a concept of cultivation strategies. If we want to have good relationships with publics, how do we cultivate a good relationship? What are the things that organizations do, and how do they communicate in ways that are more likely to create and cultivate a good relationship? You see my farm background here coming. I'm cultivating relationships and helping them to grow. And so essentially we concluded symmetrical strategies cultivate relationships better than asymmetrical strategies. Look at your own personal relationships. You know, if you use an asymmetrical strategy on my wife, that never works. Or vice versa. The symmetrical strategies are much more effective. And then the public relations profession has a large, faddish obsession with the concept of reputation at this point. In my mind, this is largely another one of those symbolic interpretive concepts that is given a new name. So the idea that Charles von Brunn and other business scholars have come up with the concept of reputational capital, and much of the value of an organization comes through its reputation, that is, and what people think of the organization. Well, if you dig very deeply into that, and most of the people studying well, to a large extent, public relations practitioners have grasped on this as a new way of justifying publicity in media and all of that sort of thing. In fact, just get more information out about you, that'll create a good reputation, and therefore, if you hire me to do the things public relations people have been doing for generations, I'll create a good reputation, and then we have a good explanation for the value of public relations. But our research has shown that essentially you can explain, you know, what is reputation? Well, British psychologist Dennis Brownlee said reputation is what people say and what people think and say about you. And what do people talk about when they talk about an organization? Well, largely they talk about what the organization has done. In other words, its behavior. So if you really want to manage the organization's reputation, what you have to do is participate in managing its behavior. Because then if you behave in ways that publics admire and respect, then you'll quote have a good reputation. So reputation, in my mind, is largely a byproduct of relationships. But I have studied a very simple way to measure reputation, which Brownlee originated, which is simply ask the question, what comes to mind when you think about such and such organization? And when we do this research, we find that the most common thing is the behavior of the organization. So if I say BP, you'll probably think about the oil spill. If I talk about, you know, I can go on, and I think you'll see the logic of this. Well, to conclude, haven't said much about new media, digital media, but the first thing I would say is that I've become very interested in the concept of institutionalization. That is, how does something come to be understood in a certain way over time? And if people think, if I say what public relations is, that's what comes to mind immediately. Well, to a large extent, public relations has been institutionalized as a strategic, as a symbolic interpretive rather than a strategic management function. And we've actually, some of my former students, Rob Wakefield and Ken Plowman, have actually been looking at how institutionalization in organizations changes and how we can get people to think about public relations in different ways. The final thing, which I think certain people will say the digital media have changed everything about public relations. And I recently wrote an article that was published in an Australian online journal in which I said, actually, I think that may be true for the techniques of public relations, but I think the theory of public relations has been strengthened by the digital media. Because the digital media completely places the control of communication in the hands of publics. There is no control of the messages going to publics. Publics can search anywhere they want and find whatever they want. If they don't get it from you, they'll get it someplace else. And finally, the digital media provide us a marvelous tool for gaining information about the publics. Too many people just do what they've always done, which is dump information on the public through the internet, rather than spending better part of your day looking at what publics are arising, what they're saying about you, what kind of problems they're raising. And so I think it's a wonderful tool for environmental scanning, for bringing in information. So I know I've taken you up to 5 o'clock, but we stopped 10 minutes, started 10 minutes early. But I know many of you have to go to class. If there's time for question and answers, I'm happy to stay. But if you need to leave, please feel free to do so.
Anybody have a question? Yeah, I can you speak loud enough? Yeah,
First, thanks for coming. That was great. So I know you talked about empowerment, public relations. How can, I guess based on your research, what have you found in terms of how public relations practitioners can help restore or improve their own image in terms of their profession within the field? Because, as you probably know, we're not perceived very credibly all the time.
Well, this is what I mean by institutionalization. If you ask, one of the things I used to ask my students in the first public relations class on the first day, what did your parents say when you told them you wanted to major in public relations? And I'm not sure what your parents said, but oftentimes it's one of their children who likes people and are good with communicating, but failed math or something. And I actually think, something I didn't say, but some other research that we showed that taking some data from the University of Southern California has a strategic public relations center, and it does a survey every year. And taking some of their data, we found that the strongest predictor of public relations departments that are respected by senior management is the amount of research they do. Now, if you think about this for a minute, it's totally logical. If you're going to be part of strategic management, you have to be able to contribute something. You have to be able to know when publics are arising, what publics are thinking, how can one express their concerns, and scenarios and so on. But you can't do any of that unless you do research. Now, this research can be formal or informal, and I think much of it today can be done simply by studying the internet. But doing research is probably the most important thing that one can do to become empowered. Bruce Berger, who is former executive at Whirlpool and became the head of public relations and advertising after getting a PhD, public relations and advertising at the University of Alabama. has actually written a book on, I forget the exact title, but it's something about power in public relations or something to that notion. And we talked in the excellence study about the dominant coalition, which is a concept that comes out of economics and organization studies, about when economists discovered that a single person no longer makes decisions in organizations, they asked the question of, who makes the rational decisions that economists assume that people make. So they had to come up with the notion of the dominant coalition, which is the group of people in an organization with the most power, and they became the decision makers. Well, Henry Mintzberg, who's another management scholar, wrote a book called Power in and Around Organizations that I think is a classic that ought to be included in public relations courses. It's now out of print, but I have 3 copies if anyone ever and it's a really thick book, and it's not quite boring reading in many cases, but he points out that people gain power when they have expertise that's relevant to a problem that organizations are facing. So it's no surprise that public relations departments often become empowered during the time of a crisis. We found over and over again that the most excellent departments got that way because of a crisis. With Union Carbide, for example, after the Bhopal crisis, when they began paying attention to public relations. So part of it is sort of sitting around and waiting for a crisis to occur and then having the expertise to contribute. Now what should we do during this crisis? One of the people from IEBC who worked with us at the beginning of the Excellent Project was a man, Jean Cormier, who's from Montreal. He said, as I listened to you, I realized that an idea I've always had for a public relations firm is really a good one. He said, I'd like to have a public relations firm that's called Rent a Riot. So anytime you're having trouble getting management to accept you, you hire my firm and we'll start demonstrating and so on. So, public relations people tend to think activist groups are really terrible, but if it weren't for activist groups created the demand for our expertise. And working with and embracing activist groups is actually a very important thing to do. But in the excellence study, we did find that knowledge was critical. And knowledge of public relations beyond simply messaging and marketing and that sort of thing, but knowledge of strategic public relations. But then actually knowing how the company works, because if you're going to participate in strategic decisions, you have to know how chemicals are manufactured. If you're in the military, you have, there are 5 different kinds of helicopters or helos or whatever, and you have to understand it. You're going to sit down with managers and so on. So that's the reason we have minors, in business or in science or something, because you really have to have that kind of expertise. And something Pat Jackson always talked about that he called managing from below. When an opportunity comes, you don't want to say to men, you're crazy, you shouldn't do that, but looking for an opportunity when there is a problem in which you know something that's relevant, and then taking that time to actually, communicate your expertise. Pat Jackson used to talk about triggering events. When a triggering event comes about, it brings the public, and then you can communicate, you contribute your expertise at that point. That's kind of a windy answer, but it really comes down to you have to know what you're doing. And as I said, public relations theory does not come from divine inspiration or from osmosis. It's something you have to systematically study and think about and develop ideas. And public relations is just like science, it's just like research. Organizations face problems, and we look at those problems as a challenge, and what do I know that can help that organization solve that problem? And that's really a fascinating job. Problem solving is what makes life interesting.
We're going to take one more question. We have the question here, and then we'll adjourn the formal part of the program. But there is a reception, and there'll be lots of time to ask Dr. Grunig a question or two there or on the podium. So we'll take the last question.
You mentioned BP and the oil spill. How does a company heal from that? I still remember the Exxon Valdez spill and purposely avoid them because of that. So do you think BP can ever recover, or like when something that large happens, is it too salient for the public to just forget about that?
The answer to a question like this often comes back to what should they done, what should they have done before the crisis occurred. I think it's going to be difficult. It's repairing relationships is very difficult. If you're married and one of the couple has an affair, it's going to take a long time to recover from that. But I've been very influenced by an organization called the CO Institute. CO spelled C-A-U-X, and it's an institution, it's an organization that's headquartered in Minneapolis that was founded in Co, Switzerland. I'm not quite sure how it developed it. There was a speaker who was the executive director who spoke at the Dr. Page Society. Stephen Young is his name. I don't know if you remember him. It was up in Cape Cod. And they look at corporate social responsibility, and they provide resources to organizations who want to engage in corporate social responsibility. And when he spoke to the Page Society, came to the realization that really it's corporate social responsibility is the responsibility of the public relations department, and so on. And I had breakfast with him one morning, and I began interacting with him. But Co Institute has put out several publications, including about the BP crisis and the financial crisis. They couch the whole thing in terms of risk. But social responsibility is knowing when an organization is creating too much risk, not just for itself, but for its publics. And this sort of the light bulb came on in my mind. Can public relations people be assessors of risk? So somebody should have known that shortcuts were being taken in building this oil rig that eventually led to an explosion. I'm not sure if the public relations person was the one who would do it. It's a technical area. But also with the financial crisis, what about all the mortgage instruments? What about all of the financial instruments that were created that were creating excessive risk? And when that risk exploded, we had a crisis. So I think we ought to think of public relations as, in terms of risk assessment, and we're the ones who are able to hopefully think of it from the perspective of public. What is the risk to employees? What is the risk to communities? And so on, and be able to, at least if one sits in a management meeting, say, have you thought about what would happen if this would blow up? What's the likely scenario, et cetera? So, to me, crisis, 4 principles of crisis communication. One is accountability. That if it occurs, you become accountable for what happened. You don't try to blame somebody else. And the second is disclosure, is that you say what happened, what you know about what happened. If you don't know what happened, what you're doing to find out. The third one is symmetrical communication. At the time of a crisis, you have the obligation to engage in dialogue with publics who are affected by it. And then the final one is the relationship principle, that if you develop relationships with publics before a crisis occurs, then you should be able to anticipate every organization has potential accidents. Sociologist Charles Perrault wrote a book called Normal Accidents, and it's a very important one for public relations. If you work for an airline, they're going to have a crash. If you work for a university, these days you could have a shooting, or you could have a rape, or you could have something. So you have to anticipate those and try to work with publics ahead of time, because then that gives you a margin of error, you reason freedom to deal with it. So obviously BP didn't do any of that beforehand. And to a large extent, I think they've been trying following the other principles, but I think because they have to develop a relationship, people don't trust them. And personally, I think they ought to stop running those stupid commercials. You know, every time I see these people in the golf telling how wonderful things are, I said they're trying to cover up something. This is somebody looking at the symbolic interpretive role, you know. And then there's that sneaky woman from the American Petroleum Institute. She'd say, you know, American oil and gas industry. I listen to her and I say, she's covering up something. So, anyway, I think that with BP is probably doing what it is doing, but you know what it's been doing in the Gulf is trying to build relationships and reestablish relationships, and actually the commercials are designed to have people testify that the relationship is improved, but do we believe them? I don't know. I think they should stop talking about it because they just keep reminding people of what happened and just calmly go ahead and build and rebuild the relationships with people who were affected and not worry about mass media coverage.
Let's thank Jim very much.